Hey everyone, welcome to Organization Management Concepts, and today we're going to discuss the manager as decision maker. A popular myth that says a good decision should be defined by its outcome. However, the truth is a good decision should be judged by the process used, not the results achieved. So in some cases, a good decision in an undesirable outcome, as a decision maker, you can control the process. But in the real world, factors outside your control can adversely affect the outcome, and using the right process may not always result in a desirable outcome, but it increases the probability. So one example, decision makers at Fox Sports, a unit of 21st Century Fox, paid $200 million for the English language rights to broadcast 2018 FIFA World Cup in Moscow. Over a 4.5-week span, this was way to be by far the biggest production undertaken in Fox Sports history. So more than 350 hours of programming across multiple networks and digital platforms. Everything seemed to be proceeding as planned until the US team lost to Trinidad and Tobago. A loss that meant the US team would not participate in the sports premier tournament. Without the US team, the network faced possible lower viewership, meaning a tougher time selling advertising, and not being able to meet the guarantees on audience exposure. So for Fox Sports, significant revenue was at stake. Was this then a bad decision? So our debunked myth suggests that if the initial process used by the decision makers at Fox Sports was thorough and reasonable, then no, it was not a bad decision. A real-world factor, then expected US team loss, outside the company's control affected the outcome. So despite this, decision makers at Fox Sports adapted to the new circumstances and decided to put greater effort in storytelling and marketing. After all, many World Cup advertisers were global companies that still wanted to get out the message about their brands to large global audiences. Managers at all organizational levels and in all areas make a lot of decisions, routine and non-routine, minor and major. The overall quality of those decisions goes a long way in determining an organization's success or failure. So to be a successful manager and to be a valued employee, you need to know about decision making. So in this video, we'll look at the types of decisions and how decisions should be made, but we'll also consider some common biases and errors that can undermine the quality of decisions and discuss contemporary issues facing managerial decision makers. So the learning outcomes on this video, we will be describing the decision-making process, explain the 3 approaches managers can use to make decisions, describe the types of decisions and decision-making conditions managers face, discuss group decision-making, discuss contemporary issues in managerial decision-making. So first, we're going to describe the decision-making process. So how do managers make decisions? And how do businesses put new ideas into action? Through a lot of decisions, that's how. So decision-making is typically described as choosing among alternatives, but this view is oversimplistic. Why? Because decision-making is a process, not a simple act of choosing among alternatives. So in this figure, this illustrates the decision-making process as a set of 8 steps that begin with identifying a problem. So it moves through selecting an alternative that can alleviate the problems and conclude with evaluating the decision's effectiveness. This process is as applicable to your decision about what you're going to do on your summer break as it is to the decisions like, for example, the school dealing with issues that could affect the school's future profitability. The process can also be used to describe both individual and group decisions. Let's take a closer look at the process in order to understand what each step essentials or entails. by using a simple example most of us can relate to. For example, the decision on buying a car. So on the first step, the identification of a problem. So the decision-making process begins with the identification of a problem, or more specifically, a discrepancy between an existing and desired state of affairs. So take the case, for example, of a sales manager of Pfizer. The manager is on the road a lot and spent nearly 300,000 pesos on auto repairs past few years. Now her car has a blown engine and cost estimates to indicate that it's not economical to repair. Convenient public transportation is unavailable, so we have a problem. A discrepancy between the manager's need to have a car that works and her current one doesn't. So in our example, a blown engine is clear signal to the manager that she needs a new car, but few problems are that obvious. In the real world, most problems don't come with neon signs identifying them as such, and problems identification is subjective. So a manager who mistakenly solved the wrong problem perfectly is just as likely to perform poorly as the manager who fails to identify the right problem and does nothing. So, how do managers become aware they have a problem? They have to make a comparison between current reality and some standard, which can be 1. Past performance, number 2. Previously set goals, or number 3. The performance of some other unit with the organization or in other organizations. So in our car buying example, the standard is past performance, a car that runs. What is relevant in the decision-making process? So in step 2, once the manager has identified a problem that needs attention, the decision criteria that will be important in solving the problem must be identified in our vehicle buying example. So the sales manager assesses the factors that are relevant in her decisions, which might include such as price, the model, the size, the manufacturer, optional equipment, and repair records. So these criteria reflect what she thinks is relevant in her decision. Every decision maker has a criteria, whether explicitly stated or not, that guide his or her decision making. Note that in this step in the decision making process, what's not identified can be as important as what is because it's still guiding the decision. So for instance, although the sales manager didn't consider fuel economy to be criterion, use it to influence her choice of car. She had to assess the criteria before choosing to include or not include it in her relevant criteria. So in steps 3, 4, and 5, in many decision-making situations, the criteria are not equally important. So, the decision maker has to allocate weights to the items listed in step 2 in order to give them relative priority in the decision, which is step 3. A simple approach is to give the most important criterion a weight of 10 and then assign weights to the rest against that standard. Thus, in contrast to a criterion that you gave a 5, the highest rated factor is twice as important, and the idea is to use personal preferences to assign priorities to the relevant criteria in your decision and indicate their degree of importance by assigning a weight to each. So in this figure, exhibit or figure number 2 lists the criteria and weights that our manager developed for her vehicle replacement decision. So what is the most important criterion in her decision? That is the price. What has low importance? Performance and handling. Then, the decision maker lists the alternatives that could successfully resolve the problem, which is in step 4. This is the step where a decision maker may need to be creative. So let's assume In our example that our manager identified 12 cars as viable choices. We have the Jeep Compass, Ford Focus, Hyundai Elantra, Ford Fiesta, Volkswagen, Toyota Prius, Mazda 3, Kia Soul, BMW, Nissan, Toyota Camry, and Honda Fit Sport MT. Once the alternatives have been identified, the decision maker critically analyzes each one. How? By evaluating it against the criteria. So the strengths and weaknesses of each alternative become evident as they're compared with the criteria and weights established in steps 2 and 3. So in this figure shows the assessed values that the manager assigned each her 12 alternatives after she had test driven each car. So keep in mind that the ratings shown in this figure, in figure number 3, are based on the assessment made by the sales manager. Again, we're using a scale of 1 to 10. So some assessments can be achieved in a relatively objective fashion. For instance, the purchase price represents the best price the manager can get online or from local dealers. And consumer magazines reports data from owners on frequency of repairs, and others like how well the car handles and that are clearly personal judgments. Personal judgments by a decision maker are reflected in 1. The criteria chosen in step 2, the weights given to the criteria, and 3. The evaluation of alternatives. The influence of personal judgment explains why two car buyers with the same amount of money may look at two totally distinct sets of alternatives or even look at the same alternatives and rate them differently. In this figure number 3 shows only an assessment of the 12 alternatives against the decision criteria, so it does not reflect the weighting done in step 3. If one choice had scored 10 on every criterion, obviously you would not need to consider the weight. So similarly, if all the weights were equal, that is, all the criteria were equally important to you, so each alternative would be evaluated merely by summing up the appropriate lines in Exhibit 3. So for instance, the Ford Fiesta SES would have a score of 38 and the Toyota Camry a score of 43. But if you multiply each alternative assessment against its weight, you get the figures in figure number 4. For instance, the Kia Soul scored a 40 on durability, which was determined by multiplying the weight given to durability by the manager's appraisal of the car on this criterion. The sum of these scores represents an evaluation of each alternative against the previously established criteria and weights. Notice the weighting of the criteria has changed the ranking of alternatives in our example. So the Volkswagen Golf GTI, for example, has gone from first to third. And looking at the analysis, both initial price and interior comfort work against the Volkswagen. So what determines the best choice? So in step 6, now it's time to choose the best alternative among those assessed. Because we determined all the pertinent factors in the decision, weighted them appropriately, and identified and assessed the viable alternatives. So this step is fairly simple. Choose the alternative that generated the highest score in step 5. So in our vehicle example, the manager would choose the Toyota Camry on the basis of the criteria identified and the weights given to the criteria, and her assessment of each car on the criteria. So the Toyota scored highest with 224 points and thus became the best alternative. What happens in decision implementation? So in step 7, although the choice process is completed in previous step, The decision may still fail if it's not implemented properly. That is step 7. Therefore, this step, decision implementation, involves putting the decision into action. So if others will be affected by the decision, implementation also includes conveying the decision to those affected and getting their commitment to it. Want people to be committed to a decision? Let them participate in the decision-making process. So what is the last step in the decision-making process? So in step 8, in the last step in the decision-making process, managers appraise the outcome of the decision to see whether the problem was resolved. Did the alternative chosen in step 6 and step 7 and implemented in step 7 accomplish the desired result? For our sales manager, that means that she have a car that reliably works. Evaluating the results of a decision is a part of the managerial control process. So what common errors are committed in the decision-making process? When managers make decisions, they use their own particular style and may use rules of thumb or heuristics to simplify their decision-making. Rules of thumb can be useful because they help make sense of complex, uncertain, and ambiguous information. However, even though managers may use rules of thumb, that doesn't mean those rules are reliable. Why? Because they may lead to errors and biases in processing and evaluating information, which is shown in this figure that identifies 13 common decision errors and biases that managers make. Let's now take a look briefly at each error. So the first error, we have the overconfidence bias, is when decision makers tend to think they know more than they do or hold unrealistically positive views of themselves and their performance. 2. Immediate gratification bias describes the decision makers who tend to want immediate rewards and to avoid immediate costs. For these individuals, the decision choices that provide quick payoffs are more appealing than those in the future. Anchoring effect describes the decision makers fixate on initial information as a starting point, fail to adequately adjust for subsequent information. First impressions, ideas, prices, and estimates carry unwanted weight relative to information received later. Selective perception bias is when the decision makers selectively organize and interpret events based on their biased perceptions. This influences the information they pay attention to and the problems they identify and the alternatives they develop. Confirmation bias is exhibited when decision makers seek out information that reaffirms their past choices and discount information that contradicts past judgments. So these people tend to accept at a face value information that confirms their preconceived views and are critical and skeptical of information that challenges these views. Framing bias happens when decision makers select and highlight certain aspects of situation while excluding others. So by drawing attention to specific aspects of a situation and highlighting them, while at the same time downplaying or omitting other aspects, they distort what they see and create incorrect reference points. Availability bias occurs when decision makers tend to remember events that are most recent and vivid in their memory. So the result, it distorts their ability to recall events in an objective manner and results in distorted judgments and probability estimates. Representation bias is when the decision makers assess the likelihood of an event based on how closely it resembles other events or set of events And managers exhibiting this bias draw analogies and see identical situations where they don't exist. Randomness bias describes when decision makers try to create meaning out of random events. They do this because most decision makers have difficulty dealing with chance, even though random events happen to everyone and there's nothing that can be done to predict them. Sunk cost error takes place when decision makers forget the current choices can't correct a past. They incorrectly fixate on past expenditures of time, money, or effort in assessing choices rather than on future consequences. Instead of ignoring sunk costs, they can't forget them. Self-serving bias describes the decision makers who are quick to take credit for their success and to blame failure on outside factors. Hindsight bias is the tendency for decision makers to falsely believe that they would have accurately predicted the outcome of an event once the outcome is actually known. Revision bias is the tendency of decision makers to assume that when an object or idea has been changed or revised in some way, it's actually been improved and is better than the original, regardless of whether truly it's better. How can managers avoid the negative effects of these decision errors and biases? 1. Beware of them and then don't choose them. 2. Pay attention to how decisions are made and try to identify the heuristics or rules of thumb being used and critically evaluate how appropriate those are. And lastly, ask colleagues to help identify weaknesses in decision-making style and then work on improving those weaknesses. What are the 3 approaches managers can use to make decisions? Decision making is the essence of management. So everyone in an organization makes decisions, but it's particularly important to managers. Managers make decisions, mostly routine ones like which employee will work what shift, what information to include in a report, or how to resolve a customer's complaint, as they plan, organize, lead, and control, as shown here on this figure. So in planning, questions should be like what are the organization's long-term objectives, what strategies will be best achieve those objectives, what should the organization's short-term objectives be, and how difficult should individual goals be. And for leading, how do I handle unmotivated employees? What is the most effective leadership style in a given situation? How will a specific change affect worker productivity? When is the right time to stimulate conflict? And for organizing, how many employees should I have report directly to me? How much centralization should there be in an organization? How should jobs be designed? And when should the organization implement a different structure? And lastly, for control, what activities in the organization need to be controlled? How should those activities be controlled? And when is a performance deviation significant? And lastly, what type of management information systems should the organization have? In a perfect world, being a rational decision maker means being fully objective and logical. The problem to be addressed would be clear-cut, and the decision maker would have a specific goal and anticipate all possible alternatives and consequences. Ultimately, making decisions rationally would consistently lead to selecting the alternative and maximizes the likelihood of achieving that goal. So for managerial decision making, we need to assume that decisions are made in the best interests of the organization. Since most decisions that managers make don't fit the assumptions of perfect rationality, a more realistic approach to describing how managers make decisions is the concept of bounded rationality. This means that managers make decisions rationally, but are limited or bounded by their ability to process information because they can't possibly analyze all information on all alternatives. Manager satisfies rather than maximize. That is, they accept solutions that are good enough. Remember that decision making is also influenced by the organization's culture, internal politics, power considerations, and escalation of commitment, which is an increased commitment to a previous decision despite evidence that it may have been wrong. Almost half of managers rely on intuition more often than formal analysis to make decisions about their companies. So, intuitive decision making involves making decisions on the basis of experience, feelings, and accumulated judgment, which can complement both rational and bounded rational decision making. And the researchers have identified five different aspects of intuition described on this figure. So, managers make decisions based on past experiences, feelings and emotions, skills, knowledge and training, data from the subconscious, ethical values, or culture. What types of decisions and decision-making conditions do managers face? So Laura Epson is a senior vice president and general manager at SmartGrid, a business unit of Cisco Systems, which is working on helping utility companies find ways to build open, interconnected systems. She describes her job as like having to put together a 1,000-piece puzzle, but with no box top with picture of what it looks like and with some pieces missing. Decision making in that type of environment is quite different from decision making done by a manager of a local Gap store. So the types of problems managers face in the decision making situations often determine how it's handled. So in this section, we are going to describe a categorization scheme for problems and types of decisions, and then show how the type of decision making a manager uses should reflect the characteristics of the problem. Some problems are straightforward. The goal of the decision maker is clear, and the problem is familiar, and information about the problem easily defined and complete. Examples might include a supplier who is late with an important delivery, a customer who wants to return an internet purchase, a TV news team that has to respond to an unexpected and fast-breaking event, or a university that must help a student who is applying for financial aid. Such situations are called structured problems. Many situations faced by managers, however, are unstructured problems. They are new or unusual. Information about such problems is ambiguous or incomplete. Examples of unstructured problems include the decision to enter a new market segment, hire an architect to design a new office park, or merge two organizations. So too is the decision to invest in a new, unproven technology. Decisions can be divided into two categories, just as problems can. Programmed or routine decision-making is the most efficient way to handle structured problems. For example, what does a manager do if an auto mechanic damages a customer's rim while changing a tire? Because the company probably has a standardized method for handling this type of situation, it's considered a program decision, which tends to rely heavily on previous solutions, such as replacing the rim at the company's expense. So managers can use three guides for making program decisions. One is procedure, next is rules, and the last one would be policies. So a procedure is a series of interrelated sequential steps that a manager can use when responding to a well-structured program. And the rule is an explicit statement that tells a manager what can or cannot be done. And lastly, the policy is a guideline for making those decisions. Examples of non-program decisions include deciding whether to acquire another organization or to sell off an unprofitable division. Such decisions are unique and non-recurring, so when a manager confronts an unstructured problem, no cut and dried solution is available. So the creation of a new organizational strategy is a non-program decision. It is different from previous organizational decisions because the issue is new and a different set of environmental factors exists and other conditions have changed. In this figure, this describes the relationship among types of problems, types of decisions, and one's level in the organization. So for structured problems are handled with program decision making, and unstructured problems require non-program decision making. So lower level managers usually confront familiar and repetitive problems and typically rely on program decisions, such as standard operating procedures. As managers move up to the organizational hierarchy, problems are likely to become less structured. However, few managerial decisions are either fully programmed or fully non-programmed. This means that few program decisions eliminate individual judgment completely, and even the most unusual situation requiring a non-program decision can often be helped by program routines. Note that program decision making facilitates organizational efficiency and minimizes the need for managers with sound judgment and experience who come at considerable cost. So the ideal situation for making decisions is one of certainty, which is a situation where a manager can make accurate decisions because the outcome of every alternative is known. However, a far more common situation is one of risk, in which the decision maker is able to estimate the likelihood of certain outcomes based on data from personal experiences or secondary information that lets the manager assign probabilities to different alternatives. And lastly, uncertainty means that the decision maker is not certain about the outcomes and can't even make reasonable probability estimates. The choice of alternatives is influenced by the limited amount of information and by psychological orientation of the decision maker. Now we are going to discuss group decision making. So how do groups make decisions? So many decisions in organizations, especially important decisions that have far-reaching effects on organizational activities and personnel, are typically made up in groups such as committees, task force, review panels, and work teams. So in many cases, these groups represent the people who will be most affected by the decisions being made because they are often the best qualified to make decisions that affect them. Decisions can be made by individuals or by groups. Each approach has its own set of strengths, and neither is ideal for all situations. One is the advantages of a group decision making. One advantage that it has more complete information and the diversity of experiences and perspectives brought to the decision process, more alternatives generated due to greater quantity and diversion of information, especially when group members represent different specialties, increased acceptance of a solution by having people who will be affected by a certain solution and who will help implement it participate in the decision. And last advantage would be to have an increased legitimacy because the group decision-making process is consistent with democratic ideals, and decisions made by groups may be perceived as more legitimate than those made by a single person, which can appear autocratic and arbitrary. If we have an advantage of a group decision making, we also have the disadvantages of group decision making. One disadvantage is time consuming, meaning assembling the group, getting decisions made. Next, a disadvantage is minority domination, meaning it can unduly influence the final decision because group members are never perfectly equal, so they differ in rank, experience, knowledge about the problem, influence on other members, verbal skills, and assertiveness. Another disadvantage would be its ambiguous responsibility. So group members share responsibility, but who is actually responsible for final outcome? So individual decision, it's clear, but in group decision, it's not. Last disadvantage is the pressures to conform. So groupthink is a form of conformity in which group members withhold defiant, minority, or unpopular views in order to give the appearance of agreement. More about the groupthink. So groupthink hinders decision making and can jeopardize the quality of the decision by undermining critical thinking in the group, affecting a group's ability to objectively appraise alternatives, and deterring individuals from critically appraising unusual, minority, or unpopular views. So how does groupthink occur? When group members rationalize resistance to assumptions, and members directly pressure those who express doubts or questions the majority's views and arguments. Members who have doubts or differing points of view avoid deviating from what appears to be group consensus, and an illusion of anonymity prevails. So full agreement is assumed if no one speaks up. And next, how can groupthink be minimized? It can be minimized by encouraging cohesiveness, fostering open discussion, and having an impartial leader who seeks input from all members. So whether groups are more effective than individuals depends on the criteria used for defining effectiveness, such as accuracy, speed, creativity, and acceptance. So in individuals are faster at decision making, and groups tend to be more accurate, make better decisions, and be more creative, and be more effective in terms of acceptance of the final solutions. So with few exceptions, group decision making consumes more work hours than individual decision making does. So ultimately, primary consideration must be given to assessing whether increases in effectiveness outweigh the losses in efficiency. As you can remember in the chapter 1, being efficient and being effective. So to improve group decision making, make group decisions more creative by 1. Brainstorming. So what is brainstorming? It is an idea generating process that encourages any and all alternatives while withholding any criticism of those alternatives. The group leader states the problem clearly, and members then free will as many alternatives as they can in a given time, and all alternatives are recorded for later discussion. We also have the nominal group technique. This helps groups arrive at a preferred solution. It restricts discussion during the decision-making process, and group members gather but are required to operate independently. So they secretly list general problem areas or potential solutions to problems. And the last one would be the electronic meeting. So this blends nominal group technique with computer technology. So numerous people sit around a table with a computer terminal, and issues are presented to the participants who anonymously type their responses onto their computer screens that are displayed on a projection screen. The major advantage of electronic meetings are anonymity, honesty, speed, and cost effectiveness. Discussions do not digress, and many participants can talk at once without interrupting the others. The video conference is a variant linking media and people from different locations, increasing the efficiency with which decisions are made. So what we're doing right now is a video conference. We are now going to discuss contemporary issues in managerial decision making. So bad decisions can cost millions. So research shows that decision-making practices differ from country to country, and two examples of decision variables that reflect a country's national cultural environment are: 1. The way decisions are made, or whether by group or team members, participatively or autocratically by an individual manager, and the degree of risk a decision maker is willing to take. So for example, decision making in Japan is a group-oriented and values conformity and cooperation. So Japanese consensus-forming group decisions are called ringisei, reflect managerial decisions that take a long-term perspective rather than focusing on short-term profits, as it is often the practice in the United States. So managers who deal with employees from diverse cultures need to recognize the common and accepted behavior when asking them to make decisions. Those who accommodate the diversity in decision-making philosophies and practices can reap the benefits of capturing the perspectives and strengths that a diverse workforce offers. So how can you unleash your creativity? So creativity allows a decision maker to appraise and understand a problem fully, see problems others can see, and identify all viable alternatives. So most people have the capacity to be at least moderately creative, so individuals and organizations can stimulate employee creativity by adhering to the creativity model, which proposes that individual creativity essentially requires expertise, creative thinking skills, and intrinsic task motivation. More organizations are beginning to recognize how design thinking can benefit them. An example, a quotation from Apple. They said that we try to develop products that seem somehow inevitable, that leave you with a sense that that's the only possible solution that makes sense. So the design thinking approach begins with the first step of identifying problems. Design thinking says that managers should look at the problem identification collaboratively and integratively with the goal of gaining a deep understanding of the situation. They should look not only at the rational aspects but also at the emotional elements. Then, invariably, of course, design thinking would influence how managers identify and evaluate alternatives. So basically, design thinking means opening up your perspective and gaining insights by using observation and inquiry skills and not relying simply on rational analysis. So with this type of data at hand, decision makers have very powerful tools to help them make decisions. However, experts caution that collecting and analyzing data for data's sake is a wasted effort. Goals are needed collecting and using this type of information. As one individual said, big data is a descendant of Taylor's scientific management of more than a century ago. So while Taylor used a stopwatch to time and monitor a worker's every movement, big data is using math modeling, predictive algorithms, and artificial intelligence software to measure and monitor people and machines like never before. But managers need to really examine and evaluate how big data might contribute to their decision making before jumping in with both feet. So the benefits of capturing the perspectives and strengths that a diverse workforce offers. So this ends our chapter 2. Thank you.